I was already 6 months into my sentence when they moved an older guy into my two-man cell, and from the second he stepped inside with his rolled mattress and metal property box, I could tell he was not built for the place. He kept his eyes down, answered questions with short nods, and moved like every step had to be approved first, which made the other inmates on the tier watch him the way wolves watch something that doesn't know the rules. I asked him his name while he was making the top bunk, and he told me in a low, steady voice that he had just been transferred from another facility after his appeal fell through. He didn't offer details, but word travels fast in a block like that, and by the end of the first chow, someone had already told me he used to be a doctor before he killed his wife and got a life sentence. He never confirmed it, but he didn't deny it either, and the way he stared at the wall for long stretches made the rumor feel heavier than gossip. For the first few nights he barely slept, shifting around on the bunk above me while the metal frame squeaked and the fluorescent lights outside our cell stayed on through count. He ate slowly, folded his clothes with careful hands, and avoided eye contact with everyone on the tier, which only made the younger guys test him with comments when the guards weren't close enough to hear. I told him straight that staying quiet was safer than trying to prove something, and he gave a small nod like he appreciated the advice but didn't have the energy to use it. On the 10th night he finally started talking, not about the crime but about the routine, asking what time count usually ran and how often they searched the cells. His voice was calm but flat, and when he asked whether the officers ever came inside during the middle of the night without warning, I remember thinking that was a strange thing to focus on. He said he hadn't slept properly in weeks, and I could hear him sitting up there long after lights out, breathing slow and steady like he was practicing something. Around 2 weeks in, the tier settled into its usual rhythm, and nothing about that day felt different except that he skipped most of his dinner and said he wasn't hungry. After final count, the block went quiet except for the distant sound of someone coughing and the occasional clank of a gate down the corridor. I fell asleep fast because that's what you learn to do in a place like that, shutting down whenever your body gets the chance. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with a full bladder, and the only light in the cell was the thin yellow strip coming through the narrow window in the door. I swung my legs over the side of the lower bunk and dropped down without looking at the floor, because after months in the same cell, you stop checking where you step. My feet hit something slick, and my heel slid forward so hard that I went down on one knee and caught myself with both hands. The concrete felt wet and thick, and my palms stuck for half a second before I pulled it up and wiped it against my shirt. I muttered under my breath that the old guy must have pissed off the bunk in his sleep, because that was the only thing that made sense in that half-awake state. I stood up carefully and took one slow step toward the toilet, but my other foot slipped again, and I grabbed at the side of the bunk to keep from falling flat on my face. When I reached for the door to steady myself, my hand left a dark smear across the painted metal, and even in that dim light I could see it wasn't the color of urine. I lifted my hands closer to the window strip, and what I saw was thick and black in the low light, running down my fingers and pooling along my wrists. I looked up toward the top bunk and saw a shape hanging halfway over the edge, one arm dangling, and something dripping steadily onto the floor below. The smell hit a second later, metallic and heavy, and I realized I was standing in a pool that had been spreading for hours. That's when I thought it was over. I had no idea what was about to happen next. The story isn't over. Subscribe the channel to continue. I shouted his name and grabbed the metal ladder, climbing halfway up before my hand slipped again on the rung that was wet and sticky. When I got my head level with the mattress, I saw his throat laid open from ear to ear, and the sheet twisted tight in one hand like he had braced himself while he cut deep. Blood was still running down the side of the bunk in slow streams, dripping onto my blanket and splashing onto the floor in steady taps that sounded louder than they should have in the quiet block. I jumped back down, nearly falling again, and started pounding on the steel door with both fists, leaving red handprints every time I hit it. I screamed for the officers on duty, my voice cracking as I kept hitting the door until my knuckles split and mixed with the blood already covering my skin. The noise carried down the tier, and I heard other inmates shouting and banging, which only made the situation sound like a full fight had broken out. Boots thundered into the day room, and I could hear keys clanking while someone yelled for everyone to back away from their doors. The slot on my door snapped open and a flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing straight on my face and chest, both soaked and streaked. The officer swore loudly and yelled for a medical code, and within seconds, more boots were running down the corridor toward my cell. They looked through the window and saw me alone on the lower level with blood on my clothes and hands, and I could see in their faces that they were trying to figure out whether I had just killed the man above me. I kept shouting that he cut himself, that he was still up there, that they needed to get inside fast because he might still be alive. They didn't open the door right away, and those minutes stretched while the blood kept dripping from the top bunk onto the concrete beside my feet. When they finally unlocked the cell and rushed in, one officer pulled me to the wall and forced my hands behind my back while the others climbed up to the top bunk. Someone checked his neck and shook his head, and then the focus shifted back to me as they marched me out into the bright lights of the day room. In full light, the red on my clothes looked darker and thicker than I realized, and the trail from the bunk to the door made it look like I had walked through it deliberately. They ordered me to strip in the shower area while another team secured the cell, and cold water ran pink down the drain as they hosed me off without saying a word. I kept repeating the same explanation, that I slipped in it when I climbed down to use the toilet, that he must have done it while I was asleep. They placed me in a segregation cell before dawn, still damp and shaking from the cold water, and told me I would stay there until they sorted it out. The box was smaller, the lights harsher, and there was no one to talk to except the echo of your own breathing. For 10 days I stayed in that cell while they reviewed camera footage from the tier and checked the timeline of counts, and every meal was slid through a slot without a single comment about what they were finding. When they finally moved me back to general population, they told me it was officially ruled a suicide and that I was cleared, but the way some of the guys looked at me said rumors would never fully die. I had to return to the same cell after it had been cleaned, and even though the mattress and paint were replaced, I knew exactly where he had lain and how long he had bled out above me. At night, I still hear the slow tapping sound of liquid hitting concrete, and I remember how close I came to being blamed for something I never touched except by accident. The worst part is knowing he planned it while I was sleeping a few feet below him, and I never saw it building even though the signs were there in every quiet question he asked. I walked into that cell thinking my biggest problem was surviving another year inside, and I walked out carrying a memory that follows me long after the sentence itself. One last question. If you were in her place at that moment, would you have done the same? Be honest, what does her choice deserve out of 10? Subscribe now, the best story is coming next.